They never wanted you to find this, not because it was dangerous in a physical sense, but because it unravels everything. Every belief you were taught about what the mind is, what reality is, and who you are, begins to dissolve the moment you glimpse what Jacobo Grinberg uncovered. His name has been erased from the textbooks, his experiments ignored, ridiculed, or buried. But the pattern is clear. When someone gets too close to the truth about consciousness, not as a metaphor, but as a measurable force that links your mind to something far greater, they disappear. Sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally. Grinberg was the latter. Before 1994, he was considered one of the brightest minds in Mexican neuroscience, a man of rigorous science, but one who wasn't afraid to ask sacred questions. Questions like, what if your mind isn't trapped inside your brain? What if it's a receiver, a translator, of an infinite field of information that is always present, always communicating, always aware? He didn't just speculate. He built laboratories. He ran experiments. He proved that consciousness could transfer between people, that two minds, separated by walls, by distance, by silence, could still sync. His model, called the lattice or lattice, proposed that behind reality as we know it lies a matrix of pure consciousness, not figurative, not philosophical, but real. A structure, a field, a code. What does that mean for you? It means the moments you've brushed off as random, the song that played just when you needed it, the person who called at the exact right time, the dream that warned you of something days before it happened. They are signs, frequencies colliding with consciousness. Your thoughts are not trapped, echoes in your skull. They are entangled signals in a vast web of intention, and when you become aware of it, when you begin to decode the pattern, something begins to shift. They don't want you to know this, because the moment you do, the systems that govern your life, the institutions that define what's real and what's not, begin to lose their grip. Power has always depended on perception. If they control your perception, they control your life. But if you reclaim your perception, if you learn how to see again, you begin to re-enter the field consciously. That is what Grinberg exposed. Synchronicity, as Carl Jung described it, was never just a poetic theory. It was a glimpse into the mechanics of a hidden language, a language that doesn't speak in words, but in symbols, signs, and patterns. Most people pass through life blind to it. They live in the illusion of randomness, not because the world is random, but because they never learned the grammar of the universe. Grinberg's work was a bridge between science and spirit, and that bridge was set on fire. But the smoke still rises, and the traces of his theory remain, not just in his writings, but in your own experiences. That moment of déjà vu. The stranger who delivers the exact phrase you needed to hear, the idea that comes from nowhere, but changes everything. These are not anomalies. They are communications from the lattice, and your mind is the receiver. Why was Grinberg silenced? Because if we accept his theory, then we are forced to confront something terrifying to the establishment, that you don't need to go outward for answers, that every human being is already wired into a cosmic network, that the brain is not the creator of consciousness, it is an interpreter, and the field it interprets is vast, ancient, and alive. He found evidence of this in the most unlikely places, not only in the lab, but in the rituals of Mexican shamans, in indigenous practices that modern science still arrogantly dismisses. But when he measured their brainwaves, something impossible happened. Patterns emerged, not random, not chaotic, but structured. They matched the signatures of distant people, of unseen events. This was not superstition, it was transmission, and he wasn't alone. Across the world, ancient traditions, from the Stoics of Greece to the Taoists of China to the Hermetic philosophers of Egypt, spoke the same language, even if the words were different. They all pointed to a unified field, a universal intelligence that connects all things. They called it Logos, Tao, the All. Grinberg called it the lattice, and quantum physics, reluctantly, now calls it entanglement. Different names, same code. But when this code is understood, everything changes, because it means the universe is not a cold, empty machine. It's a mind, and you are part of it, not just biologically, but consciously. That's why he was erased. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right. And someone somewhere realized that if the world woke up to what he discovered, control would collapse, and a new kind of human would emerge. One who sees, one who listens, one who remembers. The code is not hidden from you, it's hidden within you. Every moment of clarity you've had in your life, that sudden knowing, the way a truth rises in your chest before your mind can explain it, that's a signal. The lattice doesn't communicate in language. It speaks in resonance. It's why you feel chills when someone speaks a truth you were too afraid to say. It's why certain places feel like memories and others feel like warnings. You're not reacting randomly to the world. You are constantly translating data from a living field of consciousness. Grinberg called it the lattice. Taoism called it the Tao. The Stoics called it the Logos. Hermeticism called it mind. Science calls it the quantum field. But you've already felt it. You feel it when you walk into a room and instantly sense the mood. You feel it when you think of someone and they call you. You feel it when you close your eyes and know something before it happens. This isn't mysticism. It's a deeper form of science, one that doesn't separate observer from observed. Grinberg's experiments didn't rely on belief. He built electromagnetically isolated chambers. He placed two people inside, disconnected from all physical communication. Then he induced emotional coherence, meditation, intention, connection. What happened next was impossible under the current paradigm. Their brains synchronized, not metaphorically, literally. The EEG readouts reflected the same patterns at the same time, and they weren't in the same room. They weren't speaking. They weren't even aware of each other's condition. Something else was linking them. That something was the lattice. This meant the brain was not the source of consciousness. It was the tuner, like a radio receiving a signal from a vast and invisible broadcast. Grinberg proved this, and then he vanished. No traces, no leads, no explanations, just gone. The official story goes silent, but the pattern repeats. Every time a scientist touches the boundary where physics and consciousness merge, they're met with silence, ridicule, or disappearance. Why? Because to acknowledge this truth is to collapse the walls of control. Because if consciousness is not confined to the brain, then every institution built on separation begins to fail. Medicine, education, politics, spirituality. All of it begins to look like a misunderstanding, because the truth is, you are not an isolated organism. You are a node in a living cosmic web. And synchronicity is the language of that web. It is how the lattice speaks to you. It is how it calls you back to your path. Carl Jung tried to explain it. He said synchronicity was a causal connecting principle, events linked not by cause, but by meaning. Modern science rejected this, of course. They could not measure meaning. But Grinberg didn't try to measure meaning. He measured the field, and he found it. He discovered that in altered states, meditation, dreams, emotional flow, the brain stops trying to filter everything through logic and instead becomes a receiver of the greater field. In these states, synchronicities spike. You begin to dream of things before they happen. You sense what others are feeling without being told. You become aligned. And when you're aligned, life begins to guide you. Not through control, through symbols, through resonance, through the unfolding of a higher pattern that is already written, not as fate, but as potential. A blueprint your soul remembers, even if your mind forgot. Grinberg's lattice was not just theoretical. He found physical analogues, patterns in the brain that matched harmonic structures, neural oscillations that mirrored the mathematics of fractals and golden ratios, geometry in consciousness, harmony in thought, the same harmonics found in ancient sacred sites, the same proportions echoed in music, in nature, in DNA. How could this be a coincidence? It wasn't, because the same intelligence that moves galaxies also moves within you. And Grinberg knew it. He documented shamans accessing this intelligence directly. No instruments, no scans, just presence, just resonance. These weren't superstitions, they were technicians of the unseen, engineers of the lattice. And that's exactly what modern science could not accept. Not because it was false, but because it was unmeasurable in the ways science was trained to measure. But just because you don't have the right tool doesn't mean the frequency isn't there. You are the tool. Your consciousness is the instrument. And when you silence the noise, the opinions, the narratives, the illusions, you begin to hear it, not as a voice, but as a pull, a signal, a pattern. Synchronicity is not magic, it's alignment. And the more you align, the more clear the pattern becomes. The world begins to move with you, not because you control it, but because you've stopped resisting the field that's already guiding you. Grinberg's lattice is not a theory to be studied, it's a reality to be lived, and you've already begun. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. Synchronicity isn't rare, it's constant, but your perception determines what you notice, and that's exactly what the system has trained you to ignore. From birth, you're conditioned to filter out everything that doesn't serve the dominant paradigm. The idea that you are alone, that life is random, that meaning is invented and not discovered. This is not accidental, because once you realize that the universe is intelligent, responsive, and interconnected, you begin to reclaim your power. And power, in the hands of the conscious, is the one thing systems of control cannot survive. Jacobo Grinberg didn't start as a mystic. He started as a scientist. His studies in neurophysiology and psychology were rigorous. He published in peer-reviewed journals. He was respected, until he went too far, not into fantasy, but into forbidden reality. The moment he began connecting ancient wisdom with measurable neuroscience, the silence grew louder. Why? Because the conclusions were revolutionary. Grinberg found that consciousness isn't something you have, it's something you are. And more than that, it's not local. It exists beyond space and time. He demonstrated that two people could share brain activity patterns even when separated and isolated. These experiments violated the known laws of physics. Or rather, they violated the assumed laws, because the real laws, the deeper ones, were always there, encoded in the structure of the universe. Quantum entanglement showed us that particles, once connected, remain linked regardless of distance. Grinberg showed us that consciousness works the same way, but that connection isn't limited to individuals. It extends into a universal intelligence, a field that stores and transmits information beyond space, beyond matter, beyond the mind. This is the lattice. It is not a metaphor. It is a matrix of real, functional energy, and everything you think, feel, and do sends ripples into it. You are not separate from the universe. You are a wave in its ocean, a unique pattern in the great field of mind. And the field remembers. Ancient traditions knew this. The Stoics believed in the Logos, a rational force that permeated the cosmos, connecting all things in a divine order. Taoism spoke of the Tao, the way, a flowing intelligence that cannot be named but can be followed. Hermeticism taught as above, so below, a principle that reflected the fractal design of reality, mirroring the micro and macro, the self and the cosmos. These were not poetic beliefs. They were codified wisdom, linguistic blueprints pointing to the lattice. Grinberg didn't copy them. He rediscovered what they always knew, and he proved it. That's why he was dangerous, because he didn't preach, he demonstrated. The brain is not a factory that produces consciousness. It is a receiver, a modulator, a decoder. Your thoughts, your insights, your creativity, they are not born in isolation. They are received, interpreted, tuned, and the quality of your signal depends on your state. Meditation, deep emotion, or silence, these open the channel. Fear, distraction, noise, conformity, these close it. That's why synchronicity often comes during intense moments. Crisis, joy, solitude, awakening, because the usual filters fall away and the signal gets through. A symbol appears. A person enters your life. A message finds you. This is the lattice in motion, responding, adjusting, guiding. Not because it controls you, but because it reflects you. You don't manipulate the field by force. You align with it by truth. And truth in this context isn't a fact, it's a frequency. Grinberg's work showed that the mind, in states of deep coherence, becomes capable of perceiving information across distance and time. Shamans demonstrated this. He measured it. He scanned their brains as they retrieved knowledge about people they had never met, places they had never been. He called it a tuning process, like turning the dial on an old radio. And just like radio, static prevents reception. The lattice is always broadcasting, but most people are lost in the static. That's why Grinberg emphasized practices that quiet the noise: meditation, focused attention, non-ordinary states. These are not spiritual luxuries. They are survival skills in an age of informational distortion. Because once you connect, truly connect, you no longer need permission to know. You no longer wait for validation from institutions that serve themselves. You know, directly, through the lattice, through resonance, through a felt sense that bypasses logic and speaks in symbols, and that knowing becomes your compass. Not everything in life will be explained, but everything can be guided. Synchronicity is the compass needle. It's not about superstition, it's about deep listening, when the same number repeats, when the same theme appears in different forms, when reality seems to answer your thoughts. That is not coincidence. That is communication. The lattice is talking, and you're finally learning to hear it. Most people go their whole lives believing they are thinking their own thoughts, making their own choices, disconnected from any greater pattern. But the truth is, your mind is not generating thoughts in a vacuum. It's participating in a stream, a current of information flowing through a conscious cosmos. Grinberg discovered that what we perceive as personal intuition or coincidence is often a translation of that stream, filtered through the individual lens of your awareness. And when you're aligned, when you're clear, when you're still, that stream becomes a flood of insight. Inspiration feels like it drops from nowhere because it does. It comes from the field. It's what Nikola Tesla described when he said his inventions appeared fully formed in his mind. What Mozart meant when he said entire symphonies arrived complete before he wrote a single note. What Einstein hinted at when he spoke of intuition being more powerful than intellect. These weren't metaphors, they were evidence. Evidence that the mind can tap into a universal informational matrix. The very lattice Grinberg described. The same field shamans and sages have accessed for millennia, under different names, with different rituals, but always the same result. Information from beyond the senses. Grinberg's synergic theory bridged this. It showed that during altered states, meditation, trance, near-death experiences, the brain doesn't hallucinate. It retunes. It steps out of the narrow bandwidth of everyday perception and opens to a broader range of frequencies. And in that state, synchronicities become constant, almost overwhelming. Because the separation between mind and matrix thins. You think of someone and they call. You need guidance, and a book falls off the shelf. You set an intention and a stranger delivers the message. This isn't magic, it's architecture, consciousness architecture. But the dominant paradigm cannot accept this, because if the mind is not bound by the brain, if reality is not fixed, then all of the structures built on limitation begin to crumble. Education becomes obsolete because knowledge can be received directly. Religion loses its monopoly because connection to the divine becomes direct. Medicine transforms because healing becomes a matter of information and coherence. Governance is threatened because truly conscious people cannot be manipulated. That's why Grinberg's work was buried. Not because it lacked evidence, but because it offered too much. Too much proof that the world is not as disconnected as we're told. Too much validation for what mystics and outcasts have always known. Too much power to the individual. And so, he disappeared. Not just his body, his legacy. His name was scrubbed from academic conversations. His research was dismissed, his findings ignored. But they couldn't erase the truth itself, because the lattice doesn't depend on recognition. It simply waits for someone to tune in, for someone to remember, for someone like you. And that's why you're here. You didn't find this video by chance. You were guided, because the field is always arranging the pieces, always responding to your frequency, always delivering the next breadcrumb when you're ready. And when you begin to act on those synchronicities, not just notice them, but respond, something activates. The lattice opens. Your perception expands. Life begins to feel orchestrated but not controlled, directed but not forced, a dance, not a prison. You begin to see meaning in everything. Patterns emerge, recurring symbols, echoes of the same message, and the more you follow them, the clearer they become. You stop trying to control everything and instead focus on aligning your internal state, because you realize it's not about forcing outcomes, it's about tuning the frequency. You don't chase the life you want, you resonate with it. Grinberg understood this. He wasn't chasing mystical phenomena, he was studying how states of mind affect what we perceive as reality. He found that when emotional and mental coherence was present, people could access information they had no logical way of knowing. And when that coherence broke, the information disappeared. In other words, access to the lattice depends on your state of consciousness. The calmer you are, the more present you become, the more access you have. But if you're in fear, chaos, distraction, the signal is blocked. That's not punishment, that's physics. This is why mystics meditate, why shamans fast, why ancient initiates practiced silence. They weren't following dogma, they were clearing interference, making space for the signal. And that signal, the lattice, is always speaking. It speaks through intuition, through dreams, through subtle signs, through others. It speaks in metaphor, in mirrors, in the events of your life, and it always reflects your inner world. That's the great secret. The universe is not reacting to you, it's responding to you, and the more aligned you are inside, the more harmonious the response becomes. This is not wishful thinking, it's reality mechanics. And once you understand it, once you begin to live by it, life becomes less about control and more about listening, less about strategy and more about surrender. But not a passive surrender, an active participation in something intelligent and vast. The same intelligence that moves stars also moves through your breath. The same field that holds galaxies also holds your thoughts. And every time you make a conscious choice, every time you follow an inner pull that defies logic but feels true, you're tuning into that field. You're becoming a participant in the great unfolding. And that's the one thing no system can contain, a human being who knows they are not separate. A mind that knows it is not alone. A consciousness that remembers the code. You were never just thinking, you were listening. Listening to something that has always been there, underneath the noise of the world, waiting patiently for you to notice. The code Grinberg exposed wasn't some futuristic technology or secret ritual. It was a remembering of who and what you really are, a conscious point within a vast intelligent field that is not just around you, but within you, as you. This is the real secret that has been kept hidden, not by force, but by distraction. Because as long as your attention is fractured, you will never hear the signal. And as long as you don't hear the signal, you won't remember that you are part of it. They taught you to ignore synchronicity, to dismiss it as coincidence, to pathologize it as irrational. But what if the irrational was simply beyond the limits of the rational? What if the impossible was simply misunderstood? When Grinberg studied the shamans of Mexico, he didn't approach them as primitive or uneducated. He approached them as advanced navigators of consciousness, and what he found confirmed what ancient traditions across the world had always claimed, that reality is not passive, it's interactive, it moves with you, it listens to your thoughts, feels your emotions, responds to your attention, and it leaves clues, not for your mind to dissect, but for your soul to recognize. The world begins to feel different when you see through this lens, not because it has changed, but because your relationship to it has. You begin to understand that thoughts are not just thoughts. They're frequencies. Emotions are not just reactions. They're tuning mechanisms. Intuition is not just a gut feeling. It's your deeper intelligence speaking through the lattice. You start to realize that nothing is separate. Not truly. Not ever. The person who enters your life at the perfect time, the dream that guides your next decision, the recurring image that seems to follow you from place to place. These are not background noise. They are part of the message. And when you stop asking, "Is this real?" and start asking, "What is this showing me?" you shift. You become a conscious participant in the mystery. You become the bridge between the seen and the unseen, between the brain and the field, between the human and the cosmic. This is the true power of Grinberg's discovery, not that it reveals some external secret, but that it illuminates your internal capacity to access what has always been true, that the lattice is alive, that consciousness is fundamental, that every moment is encoded with meaning, and that by learning to perceive that meaning, you step into a deeper dimension of being. You stop resisting life and start reading it. Synchronicity becomes your compass. Stillness becomes your power. Intuition becomes your guide. And life begins to feel like it was designed specifically for you. Because it was. Not in the sense of predetermined fate, but in the sense that reality responds to your state. You are not just living inside a world. You are shaping it from the inside out. Every thought, every choice, every shift in your frequency. The more coherent you become, the more aligned the world appears. Not because the world changed, but because you tuned in. This is what Grinberg meant when he described the brain as a transducer, not a generator of consciousness, but a receiver. And the more refined the receiver, the clearer the signal. You become a channel, not in the mystical sense, in the electrical sense, a clear line between source and self, between field and form. And when enough individuals remember this, when enough people begin living from this awareness, the system cracks, the illusion collapses, and the new paradigm emerges, not as an external revolution, but as an internal awakening. That's why the code was suppressed, not because it was false, but because it returned power to where it always belonged, within the individual, within the heart, within the soul. They tried to erase him, but they couldn't erase the field. They couldn't erase the lattice, and they couldn't erase the truth that lives in your bones, in your dreams, in the moments when everything just clicks. The truth that you are not a passive observer in a meaningless universe. You are the frequency. You are the bridge. You are the message and the messenger. And your life, every twist, every synchronicity, every unexplainable knowing has been trying to remind you. You are connected. You are remembered. And the code is awakening in you now.